What is better for the environment, a real tree or an artificial tree? Now, a lot of people use the word sustainable. Which one is more sustainable? Other people like the word green. Is a real tree greener than an artificial tree? Well, obviously a real tree's greener. It actually is green, and most artificial trees are silver. But when we use the word green, we're really talking about sustainability. Is it good for the environment? In this program, I'm going to try to answer that question. I'm going to give you a bunch of pros and cons for real trees and artificial trees. We'll talk about what some recent studies tell us. What else do we do? I'll talk about using potted Christmas trees. That's another option. And then at the end, I'll talk about a number of myths regarding real and artificial Christmas trees. So I'm going to use the words green, sustainable, and good for the environment, and I'll use them interchangeably. They all mean the same thing. Which is the option that's better for the planet and our long-term health? So which is better, real trees or artificial trees? Well, the debate is still out on this, and there are lots of opposing views. One of the reasons for these views is that there are different camps with their own interests. So they're the environmentalists. They want everything green, and they're against anything that's manufactured. Then we have the lobbyists for the manufacturing company, and they're trying to convince you that the manufactured tree is better for the environment than killing a real tree. The truth lies somewhere between the two, and the answer to these kind of questions are not really that simple to come by. But there have been some studies. One study out of Canada concluded that the use of real trees uses about half as much CO2 as artificial trees. And that was based on burning the trees at the end of Christmas. If they're not burned and they're actually mulched and returned back to soil, the real tree is even better. A study out of Sweden concluded that the real tree is 5 times more environmentally friendly than the artificial tree. A more recent study dated 2021 concluded that there isn't a lot of difference between the two choices. And in fact, a lot of the harm to the environment depends on how you get the tree. If you have to drive around town to find your tree, that's actually harmful to the environment, and that may have a higher impact than on your actual choice between the two. One of the reasons why there isn't a clear answer is that it also depends on what you do with the trees. For example, I can go in town here to a lot and buy a Christmas tree. That Christmas tree might have been grown and harvested in the Maritimes. I live in Ontario, so it's traveled a long way to get to me. I had to drive to the lot to buy it and bring it home. That has a high environmental impact. On the other hand, I can drive to the edge of town to a tree farm near us and harvest my own tree. That has a much lower environmental impact. What you do with the real tree after Christmas also has a big impact. If it is sent to landfill, that tree doesn't decompose properly. Instead, it produces methane. And methane is about 20 times worse than CO2 for the environment. So if you buy a real tree thinking you're doing something good for the environment, and then it ends up in landfill, you're actually worse off than if you had bought an artificial tree. Years ago, we used to burn those trees. And when I was a kid, I remember we had this park area where all the trees in the city would be collected. And then we'd have this huge bonfire. And it was great, except for one thing. It wasn't really good for the environment. So if you use a real tree, it's really important that it gets composted somehow. Now, what about artificial trees? Well, their greenness depends very much on how long you use it. So if you buy an artificial tree every 3 years, that's worse than buying real trees. On the other hand, if you keep that tree for 10 years and use it every year, that's actually better for the environment than buying real trees. So it's pretty clear that the answer to the question isn't that simple. Now let's look at some pros and cons of each option. The pros for real Christmas trees. They absorb CO2 and they sequester carbon while they're growing. And provided that tree is composted, some of that carbon ends up in the soil. They're 100% recyclable. They're generally grown on no-till soil, so it doesn't harm the soil very much. In fact, as the tree grows, it actually improves the quality of the soil. They're usually grown on land that's not suitable for other crops. And provided you're buying these trees locally, there's less transportation costs and less fuel burn to get them to you than buying artificial trees, which come mostly from China. While the tree is growing, which is a 9 to 10-year cycle, those tree farms are habitats for wildlife. An acre of Christmas trees produces enough daily oxygen for 18 people. Well, what about the cons for Christmas trees? Well, fertilizers and pesticides are used to grow them. When they're recycled, carbon is released back into the atmosphere. The recycling process also takes transportation, which uses carbon. The big con about real trees is that they have to be replaced every year. So what about pros for artificial Christmas trees? Well, they can be used for many years, although on average most people only use them for 6 to 9 years. And that's not quite enough to make them more sustainable than real trees. The cons for artificial trees is that there's a long transportation route from the manufacturer to the place that they're actually being used. Most are made from PVC plastic, which may contain lead, phthalates, and other volatile organic carbon items. Once you get rid of your tree, it generally ends up in a landfill because they can't be recycled. And that plastic takes a long time to decompose. Here are some Christmas tree sustainability tips. Once the holidays are over, make sure that your real tree ends up being mulched. The best solution is to have it chipped and returned back as mulch in some garden. If you already have an artificial tree, keep it, and then keep using it. Provided that you use it for at least 10 years, it's a better option than using real trees. If you no longer want the tree, make sure you donate it to someone who will use it. What about using a real potted Christmas tree? This sounds like a great idea and is promoted by a lot of people. After all, you have this living tree and you can then put it in your garden and it does great things for the environment forever. Sounds like a great idea, but it's not a great idea for most people. You want a Christmas tree up in your house usually for about 6 weeks, and that's too long for a potted Christmas tree. In winter, these trees need to be kept cold. They're okay in a warm house for 2 weeks, but they're not much good past that point. Theoretically, you could take it outside every night and cool it down and bring it back during the day, but who's going to do that? So if you only want a Christmas tree for a short period of time, it is an option. Now what happens to the tree after Christmas? Most people don't live in a garden that's large enough for these kind of trees. These are big, big trees. Now, if you're living on 50 acres, that's different. You can plant it outside every year, and then next winter, buy another one and plant it outside. That works great. But for most homeowners, your yard's too small for a Christmas tree. Now, you could plant it outside and grow it for 7 years until it's a good size and then harvest it and use it like a real tree inside. That works. For most people, using these real trees that are planted are really not a good option. Now let's look at some Christmas tree myths. The first one is that you shouldn't cut down a live tree. You're harming the environment. Those trees are important to us. That's a myth that's spread by the manufacturers of artificial Christmas trees. These Christmas trees aren't trees we're collecting in the woods. These are trees that are farmed for the purpose of being Christmas trees. When that farmer cuts down that tree and sells it to you, he replaces it with a new seedling. So there are always trees growing on that land. And in most cases, that land can't be used for agriculture. So we're making use of land that's really not doing very much. Even in your own garden, there's nothing wrong with cutting down a tree. I know we all feel bad about that. We all think it's bad for the environment. But provided that you replace it with a new tree, there's nothing wrong with doing that. Don't feel guilty about that. A lot of people claim that you shouldn't use real trees because of allergies. People are allergic to these trees. Well, that's not really true. Several organizations in the US that study allergies have come out and said that there are very few people allergic to Christmas trees. And these trees aren't making pollen in the wintertime. That happens in the spring. People who are allergic are probably more likely to be affected by the dust on artificial trees that have been kept in your basement for a year. Another myth is that most real Christmas trees end up in landfill. Now that's true in some areas, but most cities now have some sort of a collection system where they gather up the trees and they make use of those trees. They don't end up in landfill. If you're not sure about your area, check that out before you buy a tree. We don't want organic matter going to landfill. Another myth is that a lot of real trees are cut down from forests. Well, there are nearly 15,000 Christmas tree farms in the US and Canada, and they grow about 500,000 trees. Only about 2% of the trees we use come from forests, and in many cases, we cut them down because we're thinning the forest, which is actually a way of reducing the harm from forest fires. We have to keep these things opened up a little bit. This idea that we harvest trees from forests is just simply wrong. Another argument against artificial trees is that they contain lead. Now, years ago, we used to put lead in PVC plastic to keep it flexible. But most of the use of lead for that was stopped in 2007. So companies have found other things other than lead that we use to keep plastic flexible. So lead really isn't a problem anymore unless you have a really old tree. And if you have one of those, well, you might as well continue using it. The lead that comes off these trees is so small that it's not a health risk. Now, the one exception to this might be as if you have small children who are crawling around a lot underneath one of these trees. That's probably not a great place for the kids because they can pick up lead coming off of the tree. But new artificial Christmas trees are not a lead concern. They do have various types of plastic in them, and plastics do have chemicals in them that are not really healthy. So that would be one argument against artificial trees. But again, we use plastic in every part of our life, and we have it everywhere. Using a Christmas tree for a couple weeks in the wintertime is not going to make much difference. Another myth is that real trees are loaded with pesticides. These kind of myths are usually generated by the pro-organic groups, and they think that pesticides are such harmful chemicals. Well, first of all, very few pesticides are actually used to grow Christmas trees. Most of them are grown in areas that don't require pesticides, and when they are, they're used in very small amounts. Trees are also not sprayed before they're harvested, so that tree you buy at Christmas time may have had a spraying early in spring or the previous year. By now, that pesticide is not really a concern. You're probably getting more pesticides in the coffee you drink and in the spinach and lettuce you're buying at the grocery store. So again, pesticides on real trees is not an issue. So there you have the facts. Now, I haven't really made it really clear which of these tree options is best. And the reason is that it depends on how you buy it, where you buy it from, and what you do with the tree afterwards. Provided you can buy a locally grown tree and you make sure it doesn't end up in landfill after, that's probably the best option. But artificial trees are also a good option, provided you use them for a lot of years. I wouldn't be too concerned about which you choose from an environmental and sustainability point of view. We have bigger environmental problems than the Christmas trees. Now, if you'd like to learn more Christmas tree myths, have a look at this right here.